Good afternoon and welcome to the User First and Viscardi Center webinar, Digital Accessibility Basics for Banking and Financial Services. We hope you, your family, and coworkers are safe and healthy. For those of you who have family or friends that are working the front lines of the COVID crisis, we thank them very much and wish them all the best. Just as an aside, we are recording this and it will be posted later. As people join, we had quite a few people sign up, but I'm sure that people could be running late. But we will post a recording of this webinar later. A couple other items before we get started. Our speakers, like many of you out there, are working from home. Please forgive any sounds that may not be in our control. For example, we're going to be using the sound in my computer a little bit later in this webinar, so we hope that we don't have any strange noises from that, or kids or dogs or anything that might be outside our houses. We also recognize that some of you may not be from the banking and financial services industry, and that's okay. I see some folks from disability groups in different states, Ohio, Minnesota, New Jersey. We are glad to have all of you, and keep in mind that many of the accessibility principles we talk about today can be applied to other industries as well. So with that, let me introduce our speakers today. I am Reagan Bartlow, Vice President of Communications at User First, and I will be your MC. My colleague, Arthur Deolis, he's Enterprise Account Executive. He supports our banking and financial services industries at User First. And we're happy to have our partner, the Viscardi Center. Jim Corporal is the Account Executive Digital Accessibility Services Executive at the Viscardi Center. User First partners with the Viscardi Center to provide full accessibility for all your digital assets, and we'll explain more about what that means as we go on today. So just a few housekeeping things. Today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and we're so pleased that you are here to join us in talking about your possible accessibility needs, or accessibility in general for, maybe you have a family member or someone that you know. So closed caption is also available as an option for those who may need it. And as we go along, you can add your questions to the chat box, but we will address them at the end. So you can also, I'll open up for questions at the end through the Q&A window. If you're having trouble with the Q&A window, you can always email me at reagan.bartlow@userfirst.com. You can also join us by telephone if you're having any sound issues. So let's talk about what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to go through the state of play. Basically, how is COVID-19 impact and how is it working with the online banking industry? And when we say banking, it might be mortgage banking, consumer banking, any of those things that anybody might need to use. We're going to talk about the risks and understanding the regulatory landscape. We'll also talk about the rewards, because there's incredible business benefits of digital accessibility. And then we're going to talk about how to apply those, apply digital accessibility to your business. So let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and online banking. As we know, the coronavirus has greatly impacted the way we live, especially when it comes to online services. The banking industry is no different, but does have some greater risks associated with online accessibility, and we will get to those. Online banking use was already increasing prior to the coronavirus. And last year, brick and mortar banks were reduced by about 1,500 locations, and largely due to banking sentiment. And you can see some of these numbers here. 80% of Americans would rather bank digitally than at a location. And then you can see how that's been impacted by the coronavirus. 63% were more inclined to try a digital app before the pandemic. And now 82% said they were concerned about visiting their local bank. So you can see how that could dramatically increase the online use. From a mortgage perspective, we know the number of loans, unfortunately, in forbearance is 8.61% at this time, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. Purchase activity is increasing, albeit slowly. Just this morning, Housing Wire reported this week that refinances are set to hit a 17-year high. Speaking of which, I just got a call by my lender to refinance because rates are so low right now. FHA's share of loans is 11.5%, and the VA or veterans share of loans are at 13.7%. Now, why do I point out those generic and broad numbers? Well, it's because you really don't know who's applying. You don't know who's applying for forbearance. You don't know who may need that FHA or VA loan, and people with disabilities fit into those two loan categories. So when we're talking about who's online banking, let me give you some more statistics here. 160 million people used online banking in 2019. We know that 20% of the population has a disability. So that could mean 32 million people with disabilities could be trying to use your services. And that's just a high potential. So imagine if you can't use your mouse because you have Parkinson's disease, and you would need to use keyboard navigation. But most websites don't fully accommodate keyboard navigation today. And again, in today being Global Accessibility Awareness Day, we want to go ahead and take an accessibility challenge and try not using your mouse for an hour, or try using your less dominant hand. See if you can navigate websites, make a purchase. And we hope that you would share this experience with us. But also understand, so people like veterans or senior citizens, people with vision problems, you actually don't know who's trying to access your online forms, your information, how do they get help, this kind of thing. So when, forgive me. So what is digital accessibility? Simply stated, digital accessibility ensures that all users, including those with varied abilities and changing abilities, and fully disabled, can use your website, app, and other digital assets to have equal access to your services. And this is often misunderstood, and there's a lot of confusion around it, which is why we have these webinars. So let me just explain to you some of the questions that both User First and Viscardi often get. And some people have the misconception that this is just a compliance thing. It doesn't really increase the bottom line to their business. And while compliance is a concern, there are business benefits, and we're going to get to those in a little bit. Speaking of compliance perspective, we also receive questions like, where in ADA can I find the Americans with Disabilities Act, can I find the specifications for how to make my website accessible? We'll answer those questions for you too. Some people have a very negative view of accessibility. They say, I know what it is, it's just alt tags, it's tedious, it's consuming. And then there's a more narrow view of how do I know that people that are blind are using my site? But that doesn't account for those disabilities like motor skills or PTSD, like I mentioned earlier. So the bottom line is your digital assets should be able to accommodate people with visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive impairments. And now I'm going to introduce and turn things over to help you better understand the risks. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Arthur Daolis, and he's going to provide you with the regulatory landscape. Arthur, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Reagan. Digital accessibility falls under several discrimination laws. Almost everyone is aware ADA can force businesses to comply with accessibility standards, but it doesn't authorize monetary compensation to those consumers. For banking and financial services, it can go much deeper than ADA. For example, Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they're buying or renting a home, taking out a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related transactions. Under the FHA, people with disabilities may request reasonable accommodations and modifications. In addition, it's illegal for landlords, property managers, lenders, and others to discriminate on the basis of someone's disability. Think of the transactions consumers are trying to accomplish: buying a home, applying for refinancing, applying for forbearance. Websites' inaccessibility can prevent people with disabilities from completing those transactions, which can violate the FHA. Also consider many of these applications are in PDF form. State laws and regulations such as California UNRRA civil rights and the proposed changes to the CCPA, which applies to online documents. But your websites would also need to be accessible for those documents to be accessed. There's also New York executive laws and discrimination laws in most states. We encourage you check with your regulatory compliance officer or risk manager, but you can see several laws can apply to the banking industry. Next slide, please. Already in 2020, more than 500 digital accessibility lawsuits, federal and state, were filed in Q1. While the coronavirus might have temporarily slowed the trend of lawsuits, the increased online use and lack of access make for a high-risk accessibility lawsuit atmosphere. The Fair Housing Act has already been cited in some lawsuits, as well as COVID-19 mentioned in several. The majority of these lawsuits are from people using screen readers. Next slide, please. Let me give you an example from the investment world. Morgan Stanley sued earlier this year, but it wasn't for the first time. This often happens when accessibility is applied once, but not continued. I will address this later and get into tips for achieving accessibility. But now you've heard from me mention PDF documents a couple times because digital accessibility is more than your website. And many banking and lending applications happen to be in PDF format. So I'm going to turn things over to Jim Corporal of the Viscardi Center to talk to you about other digital assets and also the benefits of digital accessibility. Jim?
So thank you, Arthur, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you and my colleagues at User First today to provide some information around digital accessibility, perhaps prompt you to think about your own organization's approach to your digital media presence. To recap what Reagan stated earlier, when we think about digital accessibility, we think of it in terms of three primary areas. One, the website itself. And generally websites have some form of downloadable material, and that's usually in the form of a PDF document. And we're going to show you a specific example regarding that in a few seconds. And then typically we have videos on our websites and our YouTube channels and so on and so forth. And those videos need to be captioned. So in order to be fully compliant with your digital presence, you really need to consider those three general areas. And of course, today with everyone having a mobile device, an iPhone, an Android phone, mobile applications are also a part of this category as well. So again, when you think of being compliant, you want to think of all those elements. The Viscardi Center has teamed up with User First to leverage their website accessibility experience, their services and products, which you're benefiting from today via the webinar. I'd now like to take a few minutes to talk about the other two areas, the downloadable materials and captioning. And incidentally, this presentation is completely accessible. Next slide, please. So what exactly do we mean by document accessibility? Well, it's a software coding or editing process performed by someone who specializes in accessibility authoring techniques. Basically, we ensure that your digital content is accessible by all of your internal and external viewers, including those with low vision and blindness, who utilize assistive technology such as screen reading software. And one very popular screen reading program is called JAWS. It's spelled J-A-W-S, and it stands for Job Access with Speech. Now, when Adobe PDF files, Microsoft Word documents, PowerPoint presentations are made accessible through remediation, the paragraph headings are marked, the paragraph structures are set, charts, lists, graphs, and tables are all explicitly identified, modified, and adapted, and photos and imagery and graphics are descriptively tagged. And forms may be generated with fillable fields so that a screen reader can read the content accurately, efficiently, and in the order in which the author intended it to be. Now, before we move on, we'd like to show you a video that we shot of a real client document before and after going through our remediation process to highlight the experience of a user who is blind attempting to read an inaccessible document. Can we go ahead and show the video?
The document that we received from our client, which hasn't been remediated, or in other words, made accessible. Notice what happens when the user tries to access it with their screen reading software.
Personal loan application demo.pdf-Adobe Acrobat Pro DC. Consumer loan application personal banker/loan assistant : underline branch number O individual but relying on another's assets, so we intend to apply for joint credit, left parent initial right parent applicant underline code applicant underline type of loan requested or escape.
Notice how the screen reader detected an error and couldn't read the document. Imagine how frustrating that would be for a user. Without being remediated, a blind user cannot access the information provided in the document. Now here's the same document after our team remediated it and addressed any accessibility issues.
Personal loan application accessible version - Adobe Acrobat Pro DC. Consumer loan application heading level 1. Heading level 1 consumer loan application personal banker / loan assistant : personal banker / loan assistant edit branch number edit individual radio button not checked type of consumer loan application : individual but relying on another's assets radio button not checked type of consumer loan application : individual but relying on another's assets. We intend to apply for joint credit left parent initial right parent radio button not checked type of consumer loan application : joint application applicant's initials edit applicant's initials edit heading level 2 type of loan request escape.
We can hear that after the document was remediated, the screen reader successfully and accurately read the content in the correct reading order and the number of links present, giving the user the same full experience as a sighted reader.
Okay, so we hope that certainly gives you a sense for what an individual who is low vision or blind experiences when they access or try to access a document that is inaccessible. And I wanted to point out a couple of things regarding that video. The before PDF was actually just straight text with no form fields created. You'll notice there were no radio buttons for the type of loan that they were applying for. So when we went in and remediated that document, we not only made it accessible to people with disabilities, but also for people who don't have trouble viewing documents, but they also had the ability to enter the information into the proper fields. They were able to check off what type of loan application they were applying for. So it clearly helps those with disabilities, but it also helps people in general because it's providing a much better user experience for your potential customers. And again, not to leave out your internal employees who may need this type of accessibility to do their everyday work, and again, to perform their responsibilities. So hopefully you got a sense for how frustrating it would be to try to access a document that isn't made accessible. And these principles, I know we were looking at a PDF document, but it also applies to website navigation. You'll see a similar experience as well. Obviously very frustrating. Next slide, please. So what types of materials should be made accessible? Well, there are many. Think of your everyday banking needs, statements, loan applications, such as the one we just saw in the video. If you have any investment reports, 401k reports, and so on. But companies, again, often forget about employee handbooks, employee tools, and job applications. In today's COVID environment, one may need to apply for mortgage relief. To the right is a snapshot of Truist's Mortgage Relief Frequently Asked Questions form, which is a PDF. If this PDF is not accessible to someone with a vision impairment or someone with impaired motor skills, they may be using a keyboard, then they will not be able to apply for the mortgage relief. So as a rule of thumb, any document that might be used by, again, the public, your customers, your employees, or other stakeholders should be made accessible. Next slide, please. Again, here we see another example. This is Capital One, their general banking forms webpage. You can see the varied amount of PDF forms that they are making available. Again, they need to be made accessible to help prevent barriers for people with disabilities to fill out and complete these very important documents. Again, especially in today's environment where we need access to our financial data perhaps more than ever. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll get into the weeds a little bit. How do we do it? Documents are usually created using traditional authoring tools like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. In some cases where no electronic version of a previously created document exists, the physical document needs to be scanned into a digital file format. Now, these digital files contain something called metadata or tags. And these tags identify the elements we spoke about earlier. So the headings, the paragraph structure, the charts, lists, tables if they're present, those form fields. So using proprietary software, we assess the file and we modify these tags to adhere to compliance rules, which gets us about 75 to 90% of the way to compliance. We then need to review the document for any photos, any images and graphs, and manually insert descriptive text for each so that the screen reading software knows what to read to a viewer when it comes upon a particular image. Alternative text is basically a written description of the image, much like a caption. Once we're happy with the descriptive text entries, we then perform a quality check by, quote, listening to the document using the screen reading software, where we then confirm all is as it should be. In particular, the reading order is correct and the figures and images are appropriately described. And then the final step to quality assurance is to check the remediated file for compliance. And we do this by using various accessibility checker features built into Microsoft Word. Adobe has their own version of an accessibility checker built in, and there's additional tools, the PDF accessibility checker, for instance, which is a free tool, which tests for over 140 criteria. If the checkers report any errors, we go back and we correct and retest until the file passes, and then we deliver the remediated document back to the owner. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'd like to talk briefly about captioning service, which again is integral to providing a fully accessible experience to your audience. Again, when you think of your digital presence, we can break captioning down into three basic categories: CART, which stands for communication, access, real-time translation, a little bit of a tongue twister there. And that's basically where we have a live transcriptionist, much like we do for our webinar today, who's listening to the spoken word and typing it out so that viewers can view the words and the speaking via closed caption titles. We also have post-production captioning. That's much like closed captioning, where people are used to watching TV or movies, the common CC symbol that we see. And then there's audio description, which is a form of post-production captioning and is used when the dialogue of the video content does not fully describe the action of the scene, or the dialogue simply is absent. We often see this in product videos where someone's demonstrating a particular product. The video is sometimes paused so that the captioning can be inserted and read by the viewer, and then after a significant amount of time, the video is then resumed. Captioning, we like to use human transcriptionists because they turn out to be 99% accurate, as opposed to perhaps computer-generated speech recognition software tools. The captioning can be available for, again, videos like in our webinar today, but even if you're having conference meetings where you need someone who has a special accommodation, perhaps is deaf, needs to understand what's being communicated. So again, on-site and remote via internet connections, we can do that as well. So again, a very important component to making your full digital presence accessible and compliant. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's talk about the rewards of digital accessibility for your businesses. Next slide. In the marketplace, accessibility to ensure current and prospective customers have access to all products and services materials can produce results. So collectively, people with disabilities have a disposable income of $490 billion and a discretionary income of $21 billion. I know we're sending you a lot of numbers today and a lot of statistics, but they are important, and you can see how large these figures are. By improving your user experience in terms of revenue and brand loyalty, in a report on disability inclusion from Disability In and Accenture, companies that lead in disability inclusion report 28% higher revenue. They report 2 times higher net income and 30% improved profit margins. Various surveys have shown the low vision population is growing, with over 21 million adults with non-correctable vision loss. From a revenue perspective alone, that number is quite formidable. Just think how nice it would be to suddenly have access to 21 million more potential customers than you do today. Again, these numbers really give you pause when you look at them in terms of millions and dollars and the amount of people who desperately need access to this material. Next slide, please. And again, finally, there is a tangible social return on investment for digital accessibility, and organizations that promote it are rewarded in kind. Many banking institutions have diversity and inclusion goals. For example, at JP Morgan Chase, Jim Sinaki, who is the head of their disability inclusion department and a Viscardi Center board member, reports to the CEO's office. Jim also happens to be a paraplegic. Key Bank dedicates a team to ensuring diversity and inclusion in its workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. On their website, for example, the customer service phone number is listed with their diversity and inclusion information. Accessible digital assets in the workplace boost employee productivity, for those with and without disclosed disabilities, and plays a role in the hiring, retention, and advancement of individuals with disabilities. So again, you can see how making this material accessible not only benefits people with disabilities, but also people without disabilities. So Arthur, where do organizations go from here, and how can they make their digital assets accessible?
Thank you, Jim. We've talked a lot about the importance of digital accessibility, the risks, the benefits. Now, how to make your assets accessible. Next slide, please. We like to say that the web content accessibility guidelines are the holy grail to remediation. They lay out specific check steps for organizations who are looking to improve their accessibility. Is your website perceivable? Perceivability means that a user can identify content elements by means of their senses. So if you cannot see, can you hear with a screen reader, or can you feel with a braille reader? Is your website operable? Operability means that a user can successfully use controls, buttons, navigation, and other necessary interactive elements. Imagine if you do not have the ability to use a mouse. If a page isn't logically designed, it can be nearly impossible to navigate the page using your tab key. Is your site understandable? Understandable technology is consistent in its presentation and its format, predictable in its design and usage patterns. Are your pages logically designed, or does an individual have to relearn how to navigate each page because of a lack of consistency? Think of your contact information being in the same place no matter which page you navigate to. And then lastly, robust IT. Robust IT is designed to function with all appropriate technologies, like screen reader or voice to text. Users should be able to choose the technology they use to interact with on your websites, online documents, multimedia, and other information formats. If your digital assets haven't been checked for assistive technology, this could present problems for your users. Next slide, please. So what is the best approach to fixing accessibility errors? First, you need a starting point. Test to find out how accessible or inaccessible your digital assets are. Automated testing only catches up to 30% of the accessibility errors. To really get a thorough understanding, manual testing is needed because people should be using screen readers and other assistive technologies to check for blockers. Blockers are anything that could prevent a user from moving forward on your site. So remember in the video, you just heard what happens if a screen reader does not detect an input box. This could block a person from applying to a loan. Next, remediation. These are the steps to fix those accessibility errors. Any good testing tool should tell you what's wrong. Remediation tools help you fix what's wrong. If you have a strong development team, you should be able to fix errors in-house with a good test report. If you have a smaller or an inexperienced team, you may want to work with a vendor to help fix those errors. Continually testing. You will want to test again and ensure that those problems are fixed, but also demonstrate the improvements to your site. Remember earlier I mentioned repeat lawsuits. This is often because errors resurface if not continually tested. Sites are constantly being updated with new releases, so you will need tools to constantly track, notify, and possibly fix errors. Your needs will greatly depend on the size of your business and the bandwidth of your IT or web development team. has to work with to improve those errors. Consulting with a good vendor to assess your needs and abilities will be helpful in beginning your accessibility plans. Next slide, please. So here are things that you should keep in mind when thinking how to make your digital assets accessible. First, a policy. Having a clear policy for your customers, designers, and developers will make all of the rest of the steps easier, as well as protect your business from potential litigation. Design. Accessibility needs to be accounted for in the design process. Universal design is accessible to all and a best practice. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. We just discussed the WCAG standards that are building blocks for accessibility. We encouraged you to seek out people proficient in accessibility to ensure that you meet these standards. Do not wait until your site is finished. Check accessibility during the development process. It's easier and more cost-effective to fix it while it's being developed rather than after the fact. Quality assurance directly relates to the testing that I had mentioned earlier. Mobile. Have you considered checking to see if your mobile version of your site is accessible? Adding an accessibility statement to your site. This shows your customers you care, and you will want to work with your legal counsel to determine the most appropriate way to communicate. So we've talked a lot about the considerations of your accessibility journey. So now let's discuss the solutions that can help you. Audits, level set, know where you stand and where you need to improve. Source code remediation. Writing and remediating source code is the best way to provide accessibility. You will need to be far along your accessibility journey with developers knowledgeable in testing and be able to ensure it's done properly. Automated testing isn't going to catch everything, as I had mentioned earlier, but it will ensure that your new releases have a minimum level of accessibility. Third-party plugins. To get accessible quickly, you can use a third-party tool to help remediate your public-facing site. They can provide some accessibility features, but they do not fix everything. Re-encourage both automated and manual remediation to improve the user experience and meet those WCAG guidelines. Be careful. There are many companies providing quick fix plugins that claim AI will fix everything. Without real humans testing with assistive technologies, they do not meet WCAG guidelines. So do your research, ask a lot of questions before selecting a vendor. Training. If you want to manage your accessibility in-house, then ensure new developers receive accessibility training during the onboarding process and that everyone receives yearly refreshers covering the advanced topics. Training combined with QA testing will allow you to be self-sufficient. Next slide, please. Native mobile apps, much of the considerations for mobile is the same as your website. Except be aware for the mobile, there are different screen readers for each platform, which are a part of the operating system. You will need to QA test the app, which is different screen readers that can be used for your website. When it comes to solutions for improving accessibility, currently there's no simple quick fix for native apps, automated testing platforms. These need to be fixed on a source code level. Accessibility testing and manual user experience testing is the best way to uncover user experience blockers and understand what needs to be improved on within your application. Lastly, ensuring your developers and designers are trained and knowledgeable about accessibility is the best way to improve customer experience on your native apps. Reagan?
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Jim. So we've given you a lot of information, and also I know that some people, we had quite a few of you join on late, and not to worry, this is recorded and will be posted to the User First YouTube page as well as linked from our website, and we'll provide those to you as well. So at this time, I am going to open up the floor to Q&A. We have had a couple of questions, and somebody had asked us if these numbers were from North America, global, or USA. These are all US numbers and data that we provided you, mostly because that's who asked us questions. But if you think of people in the disability community on a global aspect, globally, there's about 15% of the world. So you're getting about 1 billion people that may have a disability. And then those buying power and those numbers would also change exponentially. But around the world, there's about 15% of the world has some form of a disability. But all the numbers we provided you here today are US numbers. We've also had another question. Let me open this one up. What screen readers are typically used by folks using standard web HTML5 sites via mobile on Android, iOS? Are screen readers preferred are screen readers preferred different by language? Arthur, do you want to take that one first, since you were talking about screen readers?
That's a great question. On each one of those screen reader sites, you'll see which languages or dialects of languages that they are compatible with. Screen readers are international. You do see a division typically where JAWS is predominantly located in North America, where NVDA is more on the international side. The same side of the coin, there are different screen readers for mobile. So for Android, it would be TalkBack, and for iOS, it is VoiceOver. Each one of those have different language compatibilities, and those are all third-party tools where you'd have to check exactly where they would sync up.
Jim, do you have some experience with this that you'd like to add on?
Sure, Reagan. With respect to PDF documentation, which is kind of our strong suit, we see two primary screen reading applications. JAWS, the one I mentioned earlier, which is it's kind of the industry standard, industry Cadillac, so to speak, of screen reading software. It is commercially available. You do have to pay for it. And then there is NVDA, which is a free software application, which is equally as I guess robust and equally as used for people who can't afford the commercially available software. So those two are really the dominant screen reading softwares for our electronic documents.
And does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I have a few that typically come up. So, Jim, let me start with you. Does captioning have to be performed by a human, or can a computer-based software be used instead?
Yeah, so I touched briefly about that earlier. There's automated software, speech recognition, ASR. It's very good. Technology is certainly making advances in that field. However, there really is no true replacement for a human transcriptionist. We quite often do or provide transcription services for various seminars, webinars, conferences, where our transcriptionists have access to the material, the presentation ahead of time. And quite often that material is not common. The terminology is not readily used or known by many people. So having that information ahead of time kind of provides our transcriptionists with that extra, I guess, advantage, so that when they need to communicate that to our viewers, our listeners, that they're spelling that terminology correctly, that they're understanding the context in which that terminology is being used. So automated speech recognition is good. Like I said, there's still no true replacement yet for good old-fashioned humans doing this. And they can get 99% accuracy. They can also type and transcribe 200 plus words a minute. So more than suitable for captioning. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've had a question come from our audience. Are there any standard references for accessibility and grammatical standards in different non-English languages? For example, capitalization affects screen reader interpretation, but rules for capitalization vary by language. German, for example, I know French, Spanish. So I think the question here is, does the screen reader allow for that? What experience do either of you, and we can start with Jim with this one. What is your advice on screen readers with different languages?
Yeah, so great question. So I'm not a screen reader expert, but I do know that, for instance, JAWS has more configuration settings that anyone could probably count. And there are provisions for how JAWS will interpret certain content. For instance, telephone numbers. Telephone numbers have different formats now. Some organizations are using dot notation instead of the dash notation. So, a screen reader, if it wasn't set correctly, might think that it's a 7-digit number as opposed to an actual telephone number. So there are settings within inside of JAWS that will allow a user to take that into consideration. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that they probably have multi-language versions available so that the software can, in fact, account for variances of grammatical and capitalization standards across various languages. We can always follow up with a definitive on that, but that's our best guess. And again, a lot of different configuration settings with the screen readers, and it's based on the individual's particular disability and their expertise with using that particular software. Good question.
I have a great question here that both of you can address one at a time. How do you recommend the best approach? What is the best approach for accessibility when there's so much content to consider? So I know this is something, as we're user first, we're updating our own website. I'm working with right now. There's a lot of content out there. When you're talking about banking and financial services, we saw those lists of PDFs. Jim, Arthur, I know this has come up with a few of your clients as well. There's just so much content. And when we run scans, automated and manual, there are so many errors, and this can be very overwhelming. So what each of you, and Arthur can go first, what is your advice out there?
Yeah, no, Reagan, that's a great question. So when we run our scans, you really want to start off first with an audit, level set, know where you're inaccessible, where you are accessible, and then you can prioritize how you want to address it. Again, a lot of this is dependent on where you are in your accessibility journey. If you've been taking steps, if you're developing in-house with an accessibility focus, or if you're starting fresh, it can all change. But where we see the lawsuits, where we see issues is predominantly with screen readers. You can prioritize how you want to help people and how this will affect the most amount of people. And then just start knocking each down as you go. In a current instance, I was talking to a current customer of mine, and they noticed that the FHA violations, and were more concerned with that. And so we prioritized that to the top, and we started to tackle those pages first, and then so on. There's a lot of different ways to see where you have the most traffic and where the most visitors will be, and then you can start to take steps there on prioritizing where will be a good place to start.
Jim?
Yeah, just to echo what Arthur's saying, and even point back to what he mentioned earlier about having a policy statement on your website. That's a good place to document and publish what basically Arthur's just saying. We're going to tackle perhaps the most used portions of our materials, and we can then address any one-off requests if someone needs a specific accommodation regarding something that may not yet be made accessible. So, put that in your policy statement. And as far as, again, trying to prioritize the most recent documents in the PDF world should be made accessible first. And then, over time, you can start to tackle the remaining, perhaps, legacy style material that's still being made available to your consumers. Thank you.
No problem. We're going to start wrapping this up. Somebody has asked about accessibility and vision and or hearing related, but we also mentioned, and I talked about additional aspects such as Parkinson's disease, low vision, PTSD, and do we have any resources we can share? And absolutely, I have some information I can share with you. My best advice to you would be, and I typed this in the Q&A, please contact me at my email address, reagan.bartlow@userfirst.com, and I can, I'm happy to send you some information. You can also contact us at accessibility@userfirst.com, and we can get your information that way. So we can certainly send some information that would help you talk to your board members or understand the true scope of this issue and opportunity that businesses may have. I think we're going to, oh, I have one more. Oh, thank you. You're welcome. You're very welcome. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up so we don't go past 2 o'clock. We want to thank everybody for their time today. I also want to let you know that you can, if you have any questions regarding document and video and digital accessibility for your digital assets, you can contact the Viscardi Center. And here is Jim's contact information as well as their website. Again, this will be on video, so you'll be able to get it that way as well. You can also contact us at User First. There's our headquarters. Arthur's email is right there for you as well. He is welcome to help you to anything that you need from User First. You can also reach me as well, and we're both here for you. And there's our website, userfirst.com. I encourage you to follow both User First and the Viscardi Center on our social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you would follow us, and please take the Digital Accessibility Challenge and let us know how it goes for you. The Digital Accessibility Challenge on Global Accessibility Awareness Day is try not using your mouse for a couple hours and see how you can navigate the web, see if you can make purchases or order things through your keyboard. You can also, Jim mentioned, and Arthur both mentioned JAWS, J-A-W-S. They have a free download you can do. Try closing your eyes and using JAWS and see if you can navigate. So I hope that you will share those experiences with us today on our social media platforms. And again, we hope that you have a wonderful, safe afternoon, and thank you for joining us today.